Doc Slab Audio on music production and audio engineering. Welcome to Doc Slab and our fourth Master Series. I do believe this is the fourth video in our fourth Master Series. And in this video, we are going to talk about the stereo field domain. Before we get started, there is a link in the About section on this channel to a notebook that is downloadable for any viewers and subscribers. In that area, in that notebook, there is, inside the studio production section, there is another section inside of it called stereo field. And there's a bunch of information on stereo field functions. And there's also videos on my first Master Series dealing with the stereo field, and there's lots of other videos on my channel. Because the stereo field can be a very complex situation. You can do all kinds of cool things in the stereo field that aren't so much dealing with sonic balance and sonic clarity, that sometimes are just options to do something cool and to make things more lush and sound bigger and fuller. And so you might want to download that, check that out, and watch some of those videos on the stereo field and dig around on my channel some, because you can do some really cool things with the stereo field. But in this video, we're talking about sonic balance and sonic clarity. So hold on a minute and let's get started. Okay, the first thing we want to talk about is something that's going to cause us issues no matter what we do. And the first thing, as far as spectrum, if you look at this vocal, it is mono, but if you look at this vocal and you look at the spectral content, it takes up a lot of real estate. So in the next video, we're going to talk about some ways to deal with that. But there's just no doubt that just about any instrument you deal with takes up a lot of real estate. You look at this from here, from 200 hertz down to almost 100 hertz, all the way up to 16K, this vocal. That's a lot of real estate. It's not like it's little octave ranges that are, that you can keep that in, unless you're dealing with very sinusoidal sounds that they take up a lot of real estate. There's not much you can do about that. And we'll talk about doing some filtering, but you cut out too much and it's really detrimental to the sound. So you just kind of have to accept that each of the sounds take up a lot of real estate, and there's not a whole lot to do about that when you're trying to separate them. And the next thing we want to talk about is that in the same breath, if you look at this spectrum and you look at separated the same way, like it's the same separation from 20 hertz to 1600 kilohertz, but we're talking about stereo, you can't separate them that much. I mean, it really, if you take a stereo track, that you can hear it pretty well both on the right hand and left hand side. And when you start trying to scoot stuff off to the left or to the right, even if they're mono, there's only so much separation you're going to get. I mean, if you scoot things way off to the left, way off to the right, that you can get it pretty much monoed right or left. Does that make sense? But a lot of times it's kind of hard, and you're going to get some overlapping no matter what you do. So you want to take that in consideration, and that doesn't mean fluff off what we're talking about, but just understand that, there's only so much separation you're going to get in the stereo field, just like we're talking about in the spectrum here, because the sounds take up a lot of real estate in the spectrum, and they take up a lot of sound, a lot of space in the stereo field domain. And so there's only so much we can do to try to separate them to get clarity. And when we're working on our balance, trying to get things apart from each other. So really keep that in mind. Don't get lost in that. There's some tools like these Blue Cat stereoscope that can kind of help you, see how things are separated, in the stereo domain, or the stereo field domain. You might want to check those out, but basically you'll be able to hear it more than anything. You can hear a problem, then you're going to work on it as much as you can, and then there's only so much I can do. I can only separate them so much or do whatever I'm doing so much where they're going to overlap a little bit. And you will talk about that a little bit in the next video when we talk about the spectrum, and you'll be able to see that because it works the same way in the stereo field. So just kind of keep that in mind and don't die in front of the mixing board while we're talking about things. So let's take a look at the next concept we need to keep in mind. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about is stereo and mono tracks. So it's an example of this. This is a very complicated thing, but a lot of times, let's say I have a bass or a keys or something, I might not want two separate captures trying to have that nice stereo sound, or I might not want to duplicate those tracks and put delay on tunings on one side and rebalance into a stereo track, because it's going to cause a little bit of mud if you have it all squished over to one side, left or right. Does that make sense? So you might want to avoid that somehow, but sometimes I'll take tracks and bounce them stereo. No matter what the track is, I'll have almost all my tracks stereo tracks for a reason, because let's say I've got the keys over here working with the bass, and I've got the keys and the bass working closely together, but they're in a little bit different octave ranges, and at some moment the bass drops out and there's just the keys over there. So the first thing I want to do is try to scoot them in closer to center on the left hand side, and then I'm going to want to automate switch it back to a stereo track where it was mono. This is a mono track, and I've got this set to mono and mono, but when that bass drops out, all of a sudden I'm going to get thin and wispy over here, and it's really going to mess with my balance. Does that make sense? Maybe not so much the clarity, but the balance. And so I'm going to move it in really quick with automation and quickly switch it to a stereo track, so that on that left-hand side there's a little bit of fullness. Unless there's something else happening there that's taking up the space that's not causing it to sound like the left hand's dropping out really a lot. There's a lot of places to use this concept, but keeping things stereo and then switching back between stereo and mono, because things can be different at all points in time during a production. And sometimes it's better to have a mono track happening for what's going on in a certain section or movement or transition, and sometimes it would be better if it was stereo. So having stereo tracks to work with and just switching them back and forth between stereo and mono can be very helpful. Just be careful you get tracks and you take stereo tracks that you have and you try to mono them out and they're over on one side. Sometimes that can sound a little bit muddy. Does that make sense? But if it's over on one side or the other and you've made it a stereo track, bounced it to a stereo track rather than a mono track, it isn't going to have that sound. It'll just fill up more real estate. It'll go off towards center more instead of off just to one side, which will fill it out a little bit so you don't end up losing some balance. So it's a huge concept, really, taking into consideration in each section of movement, every moment in time, of whether those tracks, wherever the arrangement is at that moment, should they be stereo or mono? Can I switch it to stereo? It's going to help fill in that area if I move things around like that. No, right now I'm going to want that bass track stereo, and then I'm going to switch it back to mono, or I've got that guitar over here and it's mono playing with something else, and then it drops out or it picks up by itself a little bit, and I switch it back to stereo to fill it out a little bit, give it more body and width, so it doesn't sound so wimpy on one side. That can be for just about any instrument. So really keep that in mind and make some notes about that and experiment with that as you go through doing your arrangement and working your stereo field out. Sometimes at different moments you're going to switch the stereo field around, and you might want those tracks, certain tracks stereo, and at some different times you want them mono because of what you how the arrangement's laid out, to try to fill out, the stereo field so you got a nice, good, full sounding stereo field, which is going to, it's not so much a clarity thing, but it can be, because if you switch to mono so this keys and this guitar work together into both mono tracks, it's going to help you with your clarity. And when this other thing drops out and you just got that guitar and you smooth it over a little bit and then switch it to stereo track, it's about balance. You're trying to help the balance while this stuff over here is working, you're working with each other, that all of a sudden you don't get a wimpy one side, and it's not so much of a clarity thing, it's more of a balance thing. So those stereo and mono can help you work on your sonic balance and your sonic clarity immensely. Take really thinking about when things should be stereo or mono at each given moment in time during each section, movement, and transition can be a lot of help in you really refining your sonic balance and your sonic clarity. So let's take a look at the next concept we need to keep in mind. I certainly hope you're enjoying this video on the stereo field domain, but we need to take a break and we'll resume in the next video. So peace, hope, love. I'll see you in the next video.